So we have three very interesting papers, and we're going to start off with efficient statistical inference methods for assessing changes in species by Dennis et al. And we have Eleni Mathieu from the University of Kent and Alex Dennis from the University of Sussex, who are going to speak for 15 minutes. So over to you, Eleni.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you everyone for coming to this discussion session. So this is a brief outline of the talk and a nice picture of a butterfly. And that's just to set the tone because our work is motivated by butterflies. And just to say that we will be discussing about modeling changes in species populations using count data and then looking at changes in abundance, and also using binary data, looking at changes in distribution. So I will cover the first part, and then Alex will take over to cover the second part. So we are motivated by the global decline in biodiversity, which I'm sure you all know is a major concern. And for that, we need accurate measures of population changes. Citizen science data, so these are data collected by volunteers, by the public. They provide an incredible resource, an incredible amount of information that we can get for obtaining these measures. As we outlined in a recent paper with Emily and together with Ali Johnston from St Andrews, citizen science data also pose lots of challenges. And one of those challenges is the computational cost. The data are large, they're larger all the time, and we need to model the data regularly. So if we're going to be looking at trends, changes of population, abundance, or distribution, we need to be modeling the data regularly, or at least on an annual basis. And this is the challenge we tried to tackle in this particular paper that we are discussing today. So just a brief summary of the paper, in case you haven't read it, just so you know what's coming for the talk as well. So we're looking, as I said, for modeling changes in abundance using count data, and also modeling changes in distribution using binary data. For the former, to improve computational efficiency, we present a model reparameterization that reduces substantially the number of parameters we actually have to estimate. And for the latter, we use variational Bayes. And we demonstrate the work using citizen science data for butterflies. So why butterflies? They are in general important indicators for insects, and they are really loved by people. So we have thousands and thousands of volunteers who go out and collect data for us regularly. They also are in decline in abundance or distribution, or both in the UK. And we have different data, so both count and binary data. So we have the opportunity to develop different models to obtain trends of this type for abundance and distribution over time. We use, as I mentioned, different citizen science scheme data in the UK. So the UK BMS, which runs for about 6 months per year and gives us counts from transects. The BBC, the Big Butterfly Count, which is a snapshot count survey. And the butterflies for the new millennium, the BNM, which gives us the detection data that Alex will discuss. So when we're looking at count data, it's natural to think of a Poisson distribution, but just to say that most of the work that I'm going to discuss today very briefly for this talk has been extended to other distributions, or the work is underway to do so. But if you think of count data and you think of a Poisson distribution, when you're looking at butterfly data, your Poisson mean has to be a function of abundance of a particular site. So some sites will have more butterflies than others, and that's this NS term, so a site-specific abundance term, which is scaled by this temporal term A. And this A term is used in the model to model phenology. So if you know anything about butterflies, if you know a little bit about butterflies, you know they're not flying throughout the year. Instead, they have a kind of emergence pattern or a flight pattern. So depending on the species, they might emerge in 1 brood or 2 broods. And there's different models that we've developed over the years for modeling this phenological pattern. But these are not the focus of this particular talk. However, the focus of this talk is this NS term, so the site-specific abundance. So why is this a focus? Well, because as I mentioned, it's site-specific. So when we're looking at citizen science data, and in particular in the UK, in particular for butterflies, we're talking about thousands or tens of thousands of sites. So we don't want, or we can't, or it's computationally very expensive to have to consider models with 10,000 site-specific parameters, right, this NS. So instead, what we do is we use this so-called concentrated likelihood approach. So this allows us to substitute these NS by the scaled site totals, which you can see are a function of this A parameter, this 8 term. So that means that we can use now, we only need to make inference on models that are a function of just a handful of parameters, which we call here theta, which describe this temporal trend, and not of the thousands or tens of thousands of site-specific abundances. And this gives us a substantial improvement in efficiency. And this kind of approach, which was introduced by the group a few years ago, is now widely used. However, what is a problem, what was a limitation of this approach was that it required fitting the model to the data separately each year and then using a kind of post hoc analysis for obtaining trend. So instead, what we proposed in this paper that we're discussing today is introducing a model for the site and now also year-specific abundances that is a function of a site effect and of a time effect or year effect. And however, we still have this site effect here, and we showed in the paper how with a new concentrated likelihood approach, we can substitute these alpha S terms in another Poisson likelihood, again, making our approach computationally feasible without having to estimate tens of thousands of parameters. And so now we have a new model that jointly looks at all of the data, all of the available data across all years, across all sites and across all visits that we can fit quickly thanks to the concentrated likelihood approach, and gives us access to estimates of year effects, so which is what we want. And because we have it all in one model rather than doing things ad hoc, that means we don't rely on bootstrapping for summarizing our uncertainty, and we can properly propagate uncertainty through the process. So these are some of the results we have in the paper. So what we've got here are these time trends, these time effects, these beta R's, and you can see here, for example, for the gatekeeper, a clear decreasing trend over time. And in the paper, we also compare this new approach, extended approach, to the two-stage approach that's been used until now and discussed. So now the big butterfly count, the BBC, as I said, is a snapshot survey. I don't have much time for the talk to go through the technical details for this, but just to say that an issue with the BBC is that the survey takes place at the same time each year, which is indicated here by the blue shaded area, but the flight period of the butterflies changes. That's just naturally what they do, depending on weather. So if you just look at the raw count data from the BBC, you'll get very noisy estimates of abundance changes. And that's because in different years you hit different parts of the curve, and sometimes you hit a really good part of the flight period, and others you really only hit the tail. So in the paper we discuss how you can borrow strength from the BMS, which runs for 6 months, to adjust for this phenology effect, and then get much less noisy abundance trends. And that's all from me now, and I will pass on to Alex.
Yeah, thanks, Eleni. So the second framework we consider is occupancy model. So occupancy data are essentially presence-absent data. So it's either 1 or 0, whether you detect the species or don't detect the species. And these are used to infer species distribution when you collect data, multiple sites or multiple seasons. And the basic occupancy model is a two-stage model. So essentially the first stage is what is called the presence. So essentially we model whether the species is there or not at the site. And when they're conditional on the species being there, we model the detection. So you can only detect the species if the species is there. And if it's not there, you cannot detect it. And we can infer pattern like spatio-temporal pattern by just changing the structure of the covariance matrix in the regression equation. Or we can also estimate things like flight time by changing the regression equation of the detection probability, as we will see. So inference for occupancy model has generally been done either classically or in a Bayesian way. So classically, usually you just estimate maximum likelihood, for example, using a package. In a Bayesian framework, the state-of-art method of using inference is to do MCMC using the polygamma scheme, which allows for some computational tricks to do the inference very easily. So what we do in this talk is that we bridge the gap between the two. So the problem of Bayesian inference is obviously, even though it's exact, it tends to be quite slow. So we use a tool which is called variational inference, which still allows you to do inference in a Bayesian framework. So you will have a Bayesian credible interval with that interpretation, but in computational time comparable to what you can achieve doing classical inference. So just to give a very brief overview of variational inference. So in Bayesian inference, we have a posterior distribution, P of theta given y, and the idea of variational based is to introduce a variational family, which we call Q lambda theta, which is a family distribution indexed by a parameter lambda. And the idea is that we find the parameter lambda that best match the posterior distribution according to this criterion, which is called the elbow, which is quite a complicated object because the objective function is a mean, where the mean is with respect to the variable that you're also trying to maximize. That's why it's a bit tricky and the inference is not straightforward. So obviously the goodness of the approximation will depend on the variational family that we choose. If variational family is very expressive, then we can recover the posterior distribution very well, but obviously it's a trade-off. So the more expressive the variational family, the more difficult it's going to be to fit, while the less expressive, the easier the fits, but we're going to lose in the quality of the approximation. Okay? And the most popular approximation is what is called the mean field approximation. We just assume that we have a posteriori independence between all the parameters. And obviously, if this assumption is not satisfied, the approximation can be really bad, and you run into what is the issue of what is called underestimation of the posterior variance, because you assume independence where you actually have a correlation in your posterior. So what people have done using occupancy data is doing variational inference using this mean field approximation. So essentially assume that the parameter for your detection and the occupancy are independent, where you obviously know that for occupancy, these are generally very strongly correlated. And so you get this underestimation of the variance. What we do in our case, so first of all, we integrate all the latent variable from our likelihood, and then we consider a multivariate normal approximation as a variational distribution on the coefficient of detection and occupancy. And so essentially the parameter to be found of this variational family are the mean and the covariance matrix, actually the Cholesky factor of this normal approximation. And we've done some simulation studying, varying the number of size, detection probability, and occupancy probability to evaluate the accuracy of this, the coverage of our new approximation, and actually we recover the 95% coverage. So even though there is this small normal approximation, this doesn't actually affect the coverage of the interval, because we still recover the correlation with the occupancy and detection, which is the most important thing. And then finally, we already used the occupancy model on the B&M datasets, but we've done it using a classical Bayesian using MCMC. Now we've done it also using this variational approach. So the dataset is very big. There are more than 2 million records and more than 140,000 sites. And even though before it used to take more than 24 hours, using MCMC now it takes just an hour. So it's very comparable to like what you can achieve using classical inference. As I said, when you estimate temporal trend, for example, here we assumed like in the covariance matrix for occupancy a year effect, so we can estimate the pattern of occupancy across the years. You could also estimate spatial pattern if you use covariance. If you use spatial covariance, we haven't done that now just for simplicity. And also as a covariate for detection, we use the Julian dates and the square root of Julian date. So this is essentially just the day of the year. And so you can estimate a trend also for detection probability across the year. And what this corresponds to is essentially just the flight time. So as Eleni was saying, this butterfly fly at only a certain period. And here we can estimate when this, thank you. We can estimate when these butterflies are flying. And this is very similar to the figure provided by the butterfly conservation. Okay, so just to summarize, Eleni has introduced, as described, the work we've done on the generalized abundance index, which is very efficient because it allows you to do formal variance propagation in occupancy model without having to do this two-stage approach, and also allows you to feed the model very quickly without having to estimate all this large number of variables. And what we've done, we extended this generalized abundance index for side effects and ear effect as well. And we'd also introduce a modified generalized abundance index, which for the second data sets, since the second data set is just on snapshot service, we extended the generalized abundance index to work with snapshot service as well. And the next step is basically to combine these two type of data sets in just one unifying framework. And additionally, we also introduce a new variational technique, a new inference technique for occupancy model, which is variational-based technique, which overcome the issue of underestimation of posterior variance, as it was done in previous application of variational base, while obviously being faster than Bayesian inference using MDMC, which can be slow, but which is slow, even though it is correct. And this is just some acknowledgements. The UK BMS was organized and funded by the Butterfly Conservation, and yeah, these are all the people that we thank. Yeah. That's it.
Thank you, Elaine and Alex. Thank you for keeping to time. That's very helpful. So we're going to move swiftly on to our next paper. So this is frequentist prediction sets for species abundance using indirect information with Elizabeth Burson and Peter D. Hoff from Duke University, Durham, USA. And we have Betsy here to present. So again, you have 15 minutes.
Hi, yes, so I'm Betsy or Elizabeth, and today I'll be talking about methodology developed with Peter Hoff for constructing frequentist valid prediction sets for species abundance using indirect information. Okay. So one of the richest sources of species abundance data is this eBird database. It's hosted by Cornell University. And it contains observations of avian species counts throughout the world gathered by citizen scientists. And this database is widely used for understanding avian species abundance and biodiversity in general. And as such, it's used for constructing and implementing conservation action plans. And one unique feature of citizen science data in general is that you see this unequal sampling effort across sampling sites. So in this case, in the eBird data set, we'll be looking at a sample from North Carolina across the counties in the United States. And you see some counties with quite a large sample size. So this dark purple sort of region is the center of the state where Duke University is located. It's very populous. And then some of the smaller, more rural counties, or these small, like coastal counties, have quite small sample sizes. I think in that dark red county in the top right, there's only 8 birds in our sample. So there's quite a wide variation, and we aim to summarize data at the county level while making use of all of the information in our sample. So I'll introduce a little bit of notation to sort of ground the talk. So for County J, we say we observe N birds that fall into one of K species. Then the observed counts vector x is a vector of length k, and it can be modeled as a multinomial distribution with an event probability vector theta. Okay, so for example, if we observe a single bird, the probability that that bird belongs to the first species is the first element of our probability vector theta 1. So commonly, these data are summarized with an empirical distribution based on our sample. And there's not really a straightforward notion of uncertainty quantification with this. So we're proposing to summarize such data actually with a prediction set constructed for an error rate alpha, and we'll label that A alpha. So such a prediction set is a summary of the empirical distribution, which I'll make clear in the coming slides. And it has this frequency interpretation since it was constructed for this error rate alpha. And to be most useful, we say a desirable prediction set will have conservative frequentist coverage or be calibrated. So the probability that an unsampled bird is in our prediction set is greater than or equal to 1 minus alpha. And again, ideally, a prediction set will have a small expected set cardinality or be precise. So this prediction set, A alpha, when we're constructing it in a given county using the eBird data, will be some collection of the species observed in the sample. And ideally, that collection won't be too large. Okay, so standard methods for constructing prediction sets typically have sort of a calibration and precision trade-off. So you may proceed with a direct method where you construct a prediction set for a given county using only data from that county. And these methods result in prediction regions that are calibrated, but they may not be very precise, particularly for groups or counties with a small sample size. So alternatively, you could use a Bayesian method, maybe constructing a prediction set or region based on a posterior predictive distribution from a hierarchical model. And this can result in more precise prediction sets than a direct method, but they will not necessarily be calibrated or have the specified frequentist coverage rate. So we propose a method to mitigate this trade-off. Our method has, we say, frequentist and Bayesian properties. So specifically, I'll propose a prediction method that constructs prediction sets using indirect information, and the prediction sets will maintain the specified frequentist coverage rate. So in what follows, I'll go through. We develop and formalize an order-based prediction approach that relies on an ordering of the categories to construct the prediction set. We prove that all prediction regions of a certain type, conformal prediction regions, based on a multinomial sample, can be written as a function of such an ordering and the data. And we develop an indirect order-based prediction approach based on a hierarchical model. Okay, so I'll primarily sort of motivate the idea through this toy example. So say we have a population with 6 categories labeled A through F, and we have a known probability events vector theta given by this probability mass density plot on the left. So for such a population, a frequentist valid prediction region is any collection of the categories such that their probability masses cumulatively sum to be 1 minus alpha, so to have the appropriate alpha level coverage. So equivalently, you can exclude categories until their cumulative probability mass sums to be less than the error rate, or alpha. So we can impose an ordering on these categories. Say we just take the ordering given here from left to right as some kind of meaningful ordering to us, and exclude categories until you get to the error rate, and the remaining categories will be a 1 minus alpha frequentist valid prediction set. Okay. So you can do this for any ordering of the categories. This is just an example of one given ordering in the prediction set. In this case, we'll exclude category D, and if you were to include another, then the remaining categories would not have the appropriate coverage. So it turns out, and we prove in the paper, that actually the optimal sort of oracle ordering is that which sorts the categories according to the event probability vector. And so in this case, if you sort the categories according to the order statistics of the event probabilities, then the smallest prediction set that has the appropriate coverage will contain categories C through F. So here's a theorem sort of just formalizing that, that process of constructing a prediction region in the use of the ordering. So given by equation 1, you can construct prediction regions for any ordering with a known event probability vector theta, and the prediction region will have the appropriate coverage. Of course, in practice, the event probability vector is unknown, but it turns out that given observed data vector x, you can obtain every conformal alpha valid prediction set, so every conformal prediction set with the appropriate coverage can be written in the same way, where you replace the event probability vector with the empirical probability mass based on your sample. So here, all that remains is how to determine the ordering. Okay, so some principled approaches to obtain orderings. You could first imagine you have a sample. We can just replace the ordering with the empirical probability mass. So highlighted in blue, kind of. And this is a conditional pivot, frequentist, sort of classical prediction interval or approach. And if you have a large sample size, this will well estimate the sort of oracle prediction set. So alternatively, you could use a prior informed approach based on a hierarchical model with a Dirichlet prior on the event probability vectors with a concentration parameter gamma. And if you have some auxiliary information on how to specify this concentration parameter, or maybe we have data from other sites or counties that we could use to estimate it, then you can sort the categories according to a posterior predictive probability mass. In our article, we present an empirical-based procedure to estimate this concentration parameter using data in neighboring counties. Okay. Okay, so back to our eBird data. We want to summarize these data across counties in North Carolina. So we have counts of around 400 unique species across their 99 counties in the state. And there's some sparsity in the sample, so a lot of the species were seen very infrequently across the state. And again, as I mentioned at the beginning, there's a wide range of sample sizes within the counties. So some counties have over 50,000 individual birds identified, while others have as few as 8. And we want to obtain a prediction set for each county to summarize the information at the county level and then compare across counties ideally. So for each county, we obtain a direct prediction set where we order the categories according to the empirical probability mass using data just from that county. And we also obtain indirect prediction sets where we sort the categories according to a posterior probability mass, where we estimate that concentration parameter using data in neighboring counties. So in comparing the direct and indirect prediction sets, the indirect are only larger than the direct in 14 of the counties. So in, I think it was over 50 of the counties, the indirect sets were smaller, and the two sets were the same size in the remaining counties. And additionally of note, the direct prediction sets are frequently the trivial set that contains all 393 species, so it's not particularly useful. Okay. So I'll zoom in a bit on one of the counties to further elucidate the role of this ordering idea. So here's empirical probability mass plot for the data from Robeson County. So the bars in blue are the sample empirical probability mass, and the bars in red are the posterior predictive probability mass with that estimated concentration parameter, again from the neighboring counties. And I'm plotting the probability masses of species included in only the direct prediction sets, which are these species in blue on the far left. Species included only in the indirect prediction sets are labeled in red, and the species included in both prediction sets are labeled in purple. And this plot is sorted by the red bars, by the posterior predictive probability mass. So the species with the largest posterior predictive probabilities are included in the indirect prediction set. You can see that starting from after the blue, all of the remaining species are in the indirect prediction set. And if you were to resort this plot by the blue lines, the blue bars, then you would see similarly that the direct prediction set consists of all the species with the largest sample probability mass. And it makes sense in this case that there's a lot of overlap in some very common birds to the species, so there are a lot of these purple species that have both a large sample probability mass and posterior predictive. And so here's a little bit of what's going on. You can see the role of the concentration parameter in this plot. So in the table, I've included the percentage of all birds observed in Robeson County, so this county of interest that we're talking about, and then the 5 neighboring counties. I've just used it's called a FIPS. It's like an identifying label for a county. And on the bottom is the estimated concentration parameter using the data from those neighboring counties. So the birds in blue, the cormorant and the kingbird, were included in only the direct. And you can see that they were observed in Robeson County and seen very infrequently in neighboring counties, and that's reflected in a small estimated concentration parameter of 0 and 1.3, respectively, for these 2 species. And the 2 species included in the indirect set and not the direct, the pine warbler and the sparrow, although they weren't observed in Robeson County, they were seen with some relative frequency in the neighboring counties, and that's reflected through a quite large concentration parameter, 3.42 and 4.69 for these 2 species. Okay. So we've described a methodology to construct frequentist valid prediction sets for categorical data, and they're constructed by sharing information across all counties. And I've shown that utilizing indirect information may result in more precise prediction regions, and particularly so in counties with small or moderate sample sizes. And in general, we argue that the prediction sets, which maintain the same error rate across the counties, allow for a straightforward comparison across counties. You have the same sort of statistical guarantee across all of the counties, and it just makes it a little bit more natural to compare. And this approach is particularly useful in summarizing citizen science collected data, which often features unequal sample sizes across some domain. So thank you for your attention, and to the organizers for the opportunity to present.
Thank you, Betsy. So we're now going to move on to our 3rd and final paper. This is entitled Extreme Value Modeling of Migratory Bird Arrival Dates, Insights from Citizens Science Data by Jonathan Coe of the University of Bern in Switzerland and Thomas Opitz from INRAE in France. I'm not sure how you pronounce that.
INRAE, yeah.
So over to you, 15 minutes.
All right, thank you. So hello, everyone. Firstly, thank you very much for the organizers for the invitation. It's a great pleasure and a great honor to have our paper read at this, what has been a really interesting and insightful discussion paper session so far. My name is Jonathan Coe, and along with my co-author, Thomas Opitz, we'll be spending the next 15 minutes or so guiding you through our paper, which I must admit, the title is a bit of a mouthful. It's quite a long title, lots of things going on. So instead, what we'll be focusing on is this Venn diagram over here. Okay, this Venn diagram, these 3 different colors, which is firstly on citizen science, extreme value theory, and Bayesian hierarchical models. Okay, and the overarching theme of this session is on citizen science data, and that is also the main theme in which this paper is based on. Okay, so the idea is to try to fuse different sources of data coming from citizen science, and these sources of data present new and exciting opportunities. You know, with the advent of new technology, with increasing availability of data being made available, but it's also a bit of a double-edged sword because you know it comes with lots of you know, sometimes with a lack of sampling protocol. You know, with its the opportunistic nature of these kind of data collection methods presents observational biases that we would need to correct for when we perform statistical inference. The second theme is on extreme value theory, and that's where we're going to be invoking this theory to infer about an extremes of phenomenological events. Okay, in our case, we're looking at ecological sciences, and it's really on the first arrival of a migratory bird. All of this is nested in the overarching, in this framework of the Bayesian hierarchical modeling framework, okay? And really, in the Bayesian framework, we're given the opportunity to have posterior sampling, posterior credible intervals, and posterior inference on important latent processes, unseen processes that are very interesting from an ecological point of view. And our work really sits in the intersection of these three fields. Right, so maybe let's start out with what citizen science is. So I'll use our beloved RSS president here as an example, but let's assume that Dr. Andrew Garrett is a birder. Okay, so a birder is someone who knows a lot about birds, and is able to distinguish and differentiate between different birds. Let's also assume he likes hiking. He goes hiking, he opens up the eBird app. So it's an app, just like on your smartphone. It looks a bit like that. And then you can press tap and just start a checklist. Okay? The app notes the date and time when he starts birding, where he's traveled during the checklist, and how long he has been birding as well. Now, he goes on his hike, he spots a mallard, he notes it's, the technical term is not a duck, it's a mallard, and he can easily record it in the app, based on a pack of recommended bird species, based on the location and the time of the year. In the same checklist, he can spot different birds, okay? So, and this is really important, okay? And maybe this slide is just to say that there's more information that he can put in. He can put in voice recordings, okay? He can put in pictures, additional information, and maybe this will actually be quite interesting from a statistical machine learning point of view. Now, he finishes his checklist, and then he submits his data to eBird. Okay? eBird internally verifies it based on their checks, and then it goes into their database. How we're going to be using this kind of data is actually maybe best illustrated with a schematic, just a pictorial example. So let's assume this is the region of interest that we have, a spatial region of interest. We focus on 1 year, 2020, and then let's say we have all of these crosses are the number of checklists that were performed in that year. So it's similar to what birders have been doing, Dr. Andrew Garrett has just done just now. So what we do is we grid our data, okay, into 20 kilometer times 20 kilometer grid. And then what we can do now in this simple example is just, we call n checklist I, okay, I here is the index for space-time, in this case, pixel year, okay, the spatial pixel year, and you can just do an aggregation of the number of checklists, okay, that we have. So in this case, we have 10 checklists, we count. Then we can focus specifically on one species. Let's say we focus on the species, the purple martin, which is abundant, it's a migratory bird, abundant in the northeastern US. And then we see that in 10 of these checklists, 4 of them actually had a spotting of a purple martin, okay? So there's a binomial component coming in here, because 4 out of the 10, right? Remember, it also records the date in which he performs the checklist and he spotted the bird. So each one of these 4 purple martin spottings also had a corresponding arrival date to it. What we do is now we can take all the minimum in that pixel year, and we can consolidate that into something we call Z prime I, okay, which is just the first arrival date in that pixel year. So in this case, it would be the 28th of March, 2020. Okay, and here now I've changed the slide to have the extreme value theory there, because we are invoking extreme value theory to look for motivated models motivated by EVT to model this first arrival date. Now, there's strong temporal trends in these reported occurrences, and I think this is important to talk about in the context of citizen science, because there was really an advent of new technology with the use of smartphones, and you can see in 2001 we have something quite different from 2021. We really have an increase in the number of checklists across the whole region. Now we can do a quick exploratory analysis, so there's no modeling here, right? Let's just pull together all the pixel years, and we just do a plot of, on the x-axis, the log of the number of checklists, okay, the positive checklists, actually, we were filtering out for those, and on the y-axis, the first arrival date, okay? The higher the first arrival date, in this case, the earlier the first arrival. And there are 3 things to note with these 2 plots. They're plots, same plots, but of 2 different species. The first thing is that when you increase the number of checklists, when you have more and more checklists in a pixel year, you tend to observe an earlier first arrival. Okay, that makes sense, I think. However, there is a bit of a saturation effect, right? Because this is really just based on the phenology of the species, right? Just because we're going to be increasing the number of checklists, it doesn't mean it's going to arrive earlier and earlier, right? At some point, it'll be bounded by based on the phenology of the species. The second thing is, the third thing is that with the lower checklists, the pixel years with the lowest checklist, we see that we tend to have a later first arrival, right? Which begs the question, is this because we just didn't do enough checklists in that pixel year? Or is it really because of the phenology of the species? And that's really related to this idea of observational effort, which we really want to capture, okay? And in this slide here, I'm really just talking about what we call the preference, actually, because in our paper, there's more details there. We decompose observational effort as a function of preference, okay, which is really coming from the framework for preferential sampling by Peter Diggle and co-authors from 2010, but also with the activity. We have an additional component, which is really how much time a person spent on the checklist. There's data fusion involved as well, so how much additional data we want to put. And I want to say that this BBS data is also citizen science data. It's very different. There's more stricter sampling protocols. However, these are long road networks and really at only a fixed period of the year. Okay, we're really moving towards modeling now. The goal is to fit a realistic model to first arrival data, conditional covariates, and then correct for these observational bias from these data sets. Okay, then we can use, in this Bayesian framework, we can do posterior predictions. But what's important is we can interpolate now to locations not seen, but in a reasonable way. Okay, and the reasonable way is really based on the latent ecological niche that we wish to infer, right? Very briefly, these are the different sources that are going in. I mean, here you might already see some notation, the NI checklist, the NI species, but really we're doing a multi-response spatial regression. And one thing to note is there are these latent effects that we are trying to share between different components. Okay, in this case, the ecological niche, and in the next case, the preferential sampling aspect of it.
Yeah, so a key modeling assumption that we make is that the observed first arrival dates will be later when the observational effort is very low, but we'll observe the true first arrival dates when we have a relatively high effort. So there's a saturation effect, and we implement it in this generalized extreme value distribution and its position parameter mu. So you have this G function, which is nonlinear, which is parametric, and it will have a finite unknown upper bound for very high effort. So we estimate this function from data, and then for doing bias-corrected predictions, we can set the effort to the high saturating value. So we can stress that, well, this inference for this nonlinear and parametric G function, it's one of the main sources of computational complexity here. So in terms of results, we can look at the goodness of fit, for instance, by visual comparisons. So here we focus on the great-crested flycatcher as an example species. On the left, we have eBird observations. On the right maps, we have posterior predictions. So the top row is for the number of checklists. The bottom row is for the species presence probability. So in general, there's a really good match. And sometimes there are slight differences, and these are in fact due to information that is shared over from the BBS data through this sharing mechanism in our Bayesian hierarchical model. So once we have fitted a model, we can then use it to perform bias-corrected predictions of first arrivals. So we set then a very high observational effort, the saturating one. And you can see this here in the bottom row in the two maps. So on the left, we have the posterior predictive map where we have used the saturated effort. So you can see that the predicted first arrival dates are typically earlier than the observed one. And then on the right, in the bottom row, you can see that we have masked some pixels. So these are those for which the species presence probability was estimated to be very low. So where we cannot be sure that the species is present in this pixel. Okay, so here in this table, for 4 species, you can see some important estimated hyperparameters, and also some more predictions, bias corrected or not, for 2 specific pixels here. So what we can see is that the estimated first arrivals, so without bias corrections, they tend to be, well, earlier if we have higher preference, if we have higher activity, and when we're in the core area of the niche. And well, what we also see is that the bias-corrected first arrival dates are typically clearly earlier than the predicted ones, but without any bias correction. And it is nice that we can predict in pixels where we have no observations. And if there is doubt about the presence of a species, then we will not do prediction. Okay, we have a model that achieves ecological data fusion using this latent process framework. So based on data of observations that are incomplete and biased with respect to the true processes that we are interested in. So we define latent interpreted processes for the effort, but also for the ecological properties that we're interested in. And then we can get statistical identifiability of these different processes thanks to this sharing of random effects in a Bayesian hierarchical model. However, statistical validation remains challenging here. Our model is also spatiotemporal and not purely spatial. So that's a quite active area of research currently, because it can provide interesting insights into the temporal dynamics of the species populations. So a difficulty with this is that it requires, to appropriately do the disentangling of complex observational and ecological dynamics. There's also another question that we would like to ask here is if it would be possible to implement these shared latent process structures in other statistical learning algorithms that would be easier and faster to implement and to use than the Bayesian hierarchical models that we are using here. So in our study, we have this checklist data of eBird. So this is quite convenient because they allow generating pseudo absences. But actually, there are many opportunistic data sets in citizen science that are much less structured. So this idea of data fusion is really fundamental. So where we put together opportunistic and structured data in so-called integrated species distribution models. There are also some cases where we have only opportunistic data. In those cases, it might be necessary to collect additional exhaustive field data, which is very costly. And so it could be interesting to use Bayesian hierarchical modeling to explore how we could do optimal sampling designs through simulation in those cases. So our work here provides an ecological extreme value analysis. So admittedly, extreme value theory, it's in general less relevant for discrete data that we commonly have in ecology, but it is very promising for modeling extreme phenological events such as the first arrivals that we have studied here. Extreme value theory is already very widely used for modeling extreme climate and environmental events. So it is well known that such events can drive important shifts in species populations. And well, we could focus on very specific extreme events. So not only some long-term climate averages that are commonly used in traditional species distribution models. And an interesting added value of extreme value theories is that we can estimate probabilities and we can do simulation for these high impact events. So in our approach, the handling of covariates and time trends, it's still maybe relatively basic. So there could be still some room for improvement. Statistical validation of latent process inference and of these extrapolated predictions, it's also notoriously difficult. But maybe one possibility to do it here would be to use holdout data, where we stratify to artificially reduce the observational effort during the training phase of the model. And then we can check if our model extrapolates correctly to the saturated observational effort. Well, there's a very wide variety of ecological data sets. So this can be small data, this can be big data. Almost always they are very complex data. So these provide us with really wide opportunities for modeling and for decision support. And yeah, we believe that this is a really exciting playground for statisticians at the interface of citizen science, of Bayesian hierarchical modeling, and of extreme value theory. So to conclude, I would like to thank you for your attention, and well, we're looking forward to the contributions in the discussion.
Thank you, Jonathan and Thomas. Okay, so we now move on to the next stage of the discussion meeting, and three excellent talks there. And so, if you do want to make a contribution, hopefully that's sort of got you thinking of which paper you might want to contribute on. You can contribute on them all if you like. But now we move on to the formal bit, which is the vote of thanks. And we have the first vote of thanks, which is from Ben Swallow from the University of St. Andrews. And just say that none of the authors of those papers know what Ben is going to say. So this is the first time they will hear a Verus critique.
Great. Thank you very much, and I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to propose the thanks for three very interesting papers that I've thoroughly enjoyed reading. As Andrew said, from the School of Maths and Statistics at St. Andrews, as well as the Centre for Research into Ecological Environmental Modelling. So to motivate this, I really thought about what our job is often as a statistician. And we often think about combining data with some sort of statistical model to perform inference and prediction. And I think this is particularly important for citizen science data because the way that we combine the data with the statistical model is particularly important when we have, as has already been mentioned, some of these very complex sampling and observational processes that we see. So this is why it's such, as the last speaker said, it's such a rich playground for statisticians. It's thinking about how we combine these two things together with data that are often suboptimal in some ways compared to more robust sampling designs. So just to give an overview of my experience with citizen science data, in general, data are a vital process or part of our statistical analysis process. And they're really important for both grounding and calibrating statistical models, as well as supporting predictive modeling or forecasting. Data can be really expensive or very resource intensive to collect, meaning that it's often not possible to be able to collect it at the resolution that we would want, either spatially or temporally. So citizen science data provide a really robust alternative to that by relying on very knowledgeable amateurs, and by amateurs I mean people who aren't paid to do this job, usually volunteers, but not in terms of their knowledge or their expertise in the data that they're collecting. So it gives us the opportunity to have really high spatial and or temporal data at a resolution that just would not be possible or otherwise feasible from more standard sampling procedures. So because of that, it's really very important that we are able to model the observation or the sampling process in which that data was collected to avoid any biases being introduced into the inference or predictive modeling that we want to do. It's even more important because these data often feed into very important policy through national and or international monitoring schemes, underpinning legal obligations for conservation policy. So ensuring that we do a good job statistically of analyzing these data is therefore incredibly important. So as I said, there's a potential for a large range of biases, some of which we've already heard about from the talks this evening, including oversampling. So that's where people either only report if they've seen something noteworthy or interesting or rare. Maybe there's a spatial bias, so you get more observations in areas of high population density, or people going to locations where they know they're going to see something interesting. If you go for a hike, you might want to go where you've got a good chance of seeing some good birds or good butterflies. There's also a potential for misidentification. Some of these species are incredibly difficult to tell apart, and even the experts may struggle, so we may have issues of misidentification. Partial observations, so these checklists, people might just note down species that were particularly interesting, so we potentially miss some of the more common species or less interesting ones. And finally, double sampling, if two people go to the same location on the same day or the following or subsequent days, do we know if those are different individuals that they've reported or not? So in terms of occupancy, that's slightly less problematic, but if we're trying to estimate abundance, then that can be a big challenge. So part of the process is collecting rich enough metadata that we're able to try and understand what the process of the observer was in how they collected and reported the data that they submitted. Other challenges, as we've heard about tonight already, are high-resolution data comes with computational challenges, whether that's hardware, software, inference, methodologies, uncertainty, quantification, and propagation are all very challenging with large amounts of data, and that's the same whether you're in citizen science ecology or any other area, but particularly challenging when you've got all these complex model processes going on. As well, we're often communicating with or interacting with domain experts, either the data collector themselves or if we're informing some form of policy through the results of our analysis, we may need to interact with domain experts or non-statisticians. So again, another challenge in citizen science data more generally. And we often also have a lack of involvement in the design and implementation of these studies. So the data comes to us through some app that they've been submitted to. We don't necessarily have a way of implementing or designing them ourselves. So it's therefore challenging just to deal with the data that was received. So to summarize, as already has been done, the 3 papers, starting off with Dennis et al. 2 developments they implemented. First of all, the implementation or incorporation of time and site effects into a concentrated likelihood framework, allowing for this continuous dynamical estimation of the inference that they're interested in, and then combining that with the variational inference to speed up the efficiency and inference on these data. Occupancy models are very, very widely used in ecology, so there's a huge amount of interest in developing more efficient and complex versions of these, and it's particularly nice to see some excellent examples of that here. When using the observed data likelihood, we can see some improvements in efficiency obtained from the variational inference scheme developed. We get better estimates of the uncertainty through a Bayesian approach incorporating prior information. And we can, by assuming independence or gaining independence of the model parameters through a reparameterization, we can use this variational approach to get consistent estimates of the parameters. And there's a nice simulation study implementing to show that you get good coverage probabilities of the confidence and the credible intervals for these parameters. Some comments. So the initial approach, the 2-model approach, were estimated uncertainty through the Hessian, which I would imagine would be somewhat unreliable for rarer species. So the proposal to use a Bayesian approach is particularly useful here because I think you can better able to propagate the uncertainty, and also using non-parametric bootstrapping as well also gives us perhaps more reliable estimates of uncertainty in this case. There's a very flexible approach, so we can use all sorts of different families of distributions, very easy to compare with other discrete distributions for the output, for the counts, whether that's negative binomial or quasi-Poisson. It's relatively easy to then compare between those, and having this way of separating out variance across different compartments, whether that's constant across space and time, whether that's something that's spatial or temporally indexed, it's easy to split up the model uncertainty into these different components. So that's a real bonus of these sorts of very flexible hierarchical models. I'd be interested in here the idea about incorporating more spatial phenomena into this model. So rather than assuming random effects, maybe some more, as was already mentioned in the discussion of your paper, thinking about this in a more continuous spatial process. But it really paves the way from a more efficient and fast inference for these sorts of binomial occupancy models, similar to a couple of papers have done here. So really interesting paper, lots of potential for further developments as highlighted in the discussion, and I'll be really interested to see where this research goes. So the second paper from Brighton and Hoff developed a prediction set framework for multinomial counties, and this allowed those counties that were sampled more regularly or at higher density to help inform counties where there might be less data being collected. And through a development, again, of a Bayesian framework, but in this case an empirical Bayesian framework, allows for calculating estimates of prediction of uncertainty through either conjugate or penalized complexity priors, and then using a marginal likelihood maximum approach through Newton-Raphson method, we're able to get these more efficient parameter predictive sets than under the direct method. So it really means that the more data you have, the impact of neighboring counties will be diminished. But if there's less data, then you can either rely on the prior or on the neighboring counties to better inform your data, which is a huge benefit of these sorts of integrated approaches. So another advantage is that you can assuming you can assume independence of observation across the county or within counties, then the frequentist coverage probabilities are guaranteed. As discussed elsewhere, this may not be the case with citizen science data due to perhaps preferential sampling, and I wonder if maybe some further extensions to this approach to allow for non-independence would be interesting to think about, as well as some sort of simulation study to maybe incorporate this further if it's not realistic, and what the dependence on this assumption might be. The third and finally, by no means least, is the extreme value modeling of migratory bird arrival dates. So here the authors study the first arrival dates of migrating birds from the eBird Citizen Science Project, one of the biggest globally. And we can treat the first arrival date as an extreme event. There's lots of really good theory around extreme value. So we're able to develop a very complex hierarchical Bayesian model that allows us to understand and better predict and also bias correct the arrival dates of birds, which potentially has important conservation. If climate change continues to drive early arrivals, then being able to predict these is vitally important for implementing policy to avoid that. So we are adding to existing approaches by fusing data sources with more systematic data sources to help correct for potential biases in this less robust data set of citizen science. I particularly sympathize, so again, this was discussed in detail in the discussion at the end of the talk, but the idea of trying to validate these latent variable models is incredibly complicated. Estimating the effective number of parameters is very difficult, and there's lots of different ways of doing this with very different results. So I think there's definitely more work to be done here as a community. The idea of combining these more structured and less structured data is clearly an area of promise, with several papers already doing this. And I think one step further we need to do is to try and determine when and how this should be done in a more justifiable way. Clearly, this approach has shown that it is incredibly valuable for bias correction, but can we always assume that's going to be the case? And finally, I'd be interested in hearing how you think your approach could be developed in a more multivariate, maybe a generalized Pareto distribution in a multivariate setting, to look at multi-species. That's a personal interest of mine, multi-species modeling. So maybe you could try and share some of these components across multiple species to get better ideas of rarer and less rare species coming, or less sampled species coming through that. So in conclusion, we've had three very wide, broad papers on various different aspects of statistical approaches of analyzing citizen science data, and that's shown a mix of computational, methodological, and philosophically different approaches to modeling these complex data. We can really harness the power of these data whilst accounting for potential biases or suboptimality of the sampling, either through supporting more robust data or through careful choice of the inferential framework that we use. So looking forward, ecological sciences have really made citizen science data a fundamental cornerstone of the domain, but I think there's a lot of opportunity for further method development, as well as the implementation of citizen science protocols in perhaps other domain areas as well, perhaps infectious disease dynamics, environmental surveillance, public health, for example. There's definitely further computational demands, whether that's through hardware or better software, to make these methods more easily applicable, and particularly, as I said, an absolute or relative goodness of fit for these data. But as I said, I'm really grateful to the opportunity of being able to propose, and it gives me great pleasure in proposing the vote of thanks for these 3 papers. And if you would join me in thanking the authors again.
Thank you, Ben. We're now going to move on to the second vote of thanks, and this is going to be done via video, so I'm hoping the tech is going to work. And this is from Kerry Mengerson, who is at University of Queensland, Australia. She's prepared a video, so tech people, does that go?
G'day. Thank you for the opportunity to second the vote of thanks at this meeting. I wanted to start by saying that after reading the 3 papers presented in this session, I think it's a wonderful time to be a statistician. I have 3 reasons for saying this. The first is that, as we all know, we are in the best of all professions. Statistics is currently one of the most in-demand professions globally, and in no small part due to the need to do something with the wealth of new data that's now available. And this creates an ideal space for us to flourish as researchers and practitioners. The high profile of statistics as a trusted data whisperer is in no small part due to the great efforts of our professional societies. And the Royal Statistical Society is one of the global leaders in this endeavour. So thank you. The second reason is that we not only have a fantastic new range of tools thanks to the rise of statistical machine learning, but we also have the compute power to implement our methods and shift the horizon. Models and algorithms that were nice but not practical a decade ago are common tools and established research directions. Emerging algorithmic enablers such as foundation models and quantum computing promise to open even more doors, creating again a new round of challenges and opportunities for statisticians as we formulate, validate and integrate solutions. The third reason is that we now have a huge range of new data sources available to us to wrangle, model and understand. Data from digital sensors, cameras, satellites, social media and, yes, citizen science provide rich information in their own right and as a complement to more traditional sources of data. As statisticians, we have an obligation to embrace these new data sources and be the trusted voice for researchers, practitioners, managers, and the public regarding their benefits and their deficits. If the data are rubbish, then we can and should say so. However, if there is merit, we have an opportunity, indeed a responsibility, to contribute to research, tools and applications that enhance the utility of these data, extract information in a rigorous manner, and merge the resultant insights with other sources of knowledge, thereby creating a true data-informed learning and decision-making environment. Which brings me to the 3 papers under discussion at this meeting. In accord with the theme of the meeting, the common ambition of these papers is to enhance the utility of citizen science data. Although all 3 papers focus on applications in ecology, the methodological innovations are generalisable to a wide range of other contexts. Within this broad remit, the 3 papers take slightly different directions. 2 papers focus primarily on improved models for estimation and inference, which correct for sampling bias. Elizabeth and Peter articulate a 2-stage approach, with neighbourhood information entering as indirect information through the concentration parameter of the Bayesian prior in one of the stages. In contrast, Jonathan and Thomas propose a strictly Bayesian hierarchical spatiotemporal model that similarly adjusts for heterogeneous spatial effort. Both papers comment on computational efficiency. Emily and co-authors focus primarily on this aspect and propose variational inference as an appealing solution. I've got so many comments and questions about each of these papers, but in this forum, I'd like to make just 3 points. First, all 3 authors deal with what I would call well-behaved citizen science data. That is, the data are sourced from large public studies with an underlying design, albeit not to the standard of a randomized control study. And this is great, and the contributions are very worthwhile. However, there's much more to be done. There are other biases in these data that need to be addressed to increase their trust and utility, and there are citizen science data from more wild studies that also have great value. So keep going. Second, the papers advance the practice of data fusion. Elizabeth and Peter focus on one study, the eBird survey, and fuse information across the geographic sites. Jonathan and Thomas see this and raise it to the merger of 2 separate studies with different protocols, the eBird study and the North American breeding bird survey. Emily and co-authors raise the ante again to the merger of 3 butterfly data sets. All of this work touches on a large literature that rectifies biases and gaps in this way. I call out earlier work of Sylvia Richardson in epidemiology and the United Nations Global Platform for enabling the use of different types of remotely sensed data to monitor the Sustainable Development Goals as examples. The papers also advance the practice of model fusion. In particular, Elizabeth and Peter suggest a merger of frequentist and Bayesian methods to achieve the desired improvement in the size and precision of the area-specific species prediction sets. This smooshing of models and philosophies is now commonplace and potentially very effective. But again, as statisticians, we need to ensure that this is undertaken in a rigorous manner, that all of the properties of the resultant approaches are understood, and that comparison with other approaches are thorough and fair, and that edge cases, such as the observation of only one class out of many in a sample, are carefully considered. Furthermore, we should be actively stepping into the space of fusing machine learning and statistical modelling, particularly for the analysis of citizen science data. I think that there's much more work to be done in this area. My third point is that all of the papers work hard to respect the citizen science data. That is, their new tools aim to address the characteristics of the data rather than making the shoe fit with existing tools. And this is important and pushes us to consider the relative benefits and drawbacks of employing models at all in this context. This is a longer discussion for another time. It would be remiss of me to not mention the efforts of colleagues in my part of the world to capitalise on the importance of and potential of citizen science data. A special call out to early work by Mark Bergman, Hugh Possingham and Samuel Choi in eliciting expert information to enhance ecological modelling, and more recently Edgar Santos Fernandez and Julie Versaloni for their leadership in using citizen-contributed classifications of coral cover in underwater images to improve monitoring of the health of the Great Barrier Reef. Through Julie, this effort has expanded to the Pacific Islands, which are particularly vulnerable to socio-industrial development and climate change. In summary, I applaud all of the authors in this session for their very welcome, substantive contributions to the 3 areas that I touched on in my introduction: to raising the profile of statisticians as data whisperers in the development and application of trusted methods, to extending our computational capability, and to advancing the analysis of new data sources, in particular citizen science data. it's with great pleasure that I second the vote of thanks for these stimulating, cutting-edge papers.
Great. Well, the technology worked, so that was good news. So what we're going to talk to now a little bit is the next stage. So all the authors of these papers who presented before are allowed to speak to or to respond to the questions and the points that have been raised. But before we get to that stage, we then move on to discussants, of which this is where you can actually come up and discuss any of the papers, or all three together. We have one contribution, but this I'm going to hand over to Adam. So Adam is chair of the discussions meeting committee, and he's going to sort of take it from here. Over to you, Adam.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. So we're going to start with those who gave their name already. So Andrei Sraka from the University of Ljubljana, who's also a committee member of the RSS Emerging Application section and was a key force behind initiating this call, has a discussion piece to give us now.
Thank you. So thank you to all. I will try to touch very shortly a few points that I see important, both naturally as practicing statistician, theoretical statistician, and probabilist, as well as Adam mentioned, proposal, initial, basically, of this call in the name of Emerging Applications section. So to go shortly, again, I provided list to very shortly touch on the three papers and on the general topic. I will try to be brief. So firstly, all of the three papers, I think, capture nicely a lot of the important issues that are here. While I will try to mention at the end also importance of further papers, like was mentioned in the proposers and seconders talks, to extend this analysis further. To briefly address the first paper, it was shortly mentioned. These are also some mathematical aspects. It is a novel type of data, and data usually live on some mathematical spaces, one could say. And in your paper, you mentioned reducing the functional space. It is an important question, while completely mathematical, maybe probabilistic, in the future, on what spaces such data actually live. They have different biases, they have heterogeneity, many things that were mentioned, which provides, I think, also important, I would directly say, also probabilistic aspects in this case. Second, I think all or most of the papers addressed computational efficiency, so the question is naturally how to relate, maybe, like was mentioned by Kerry Mangerson, methods, say, from machine learning, data science, and mainly computational statistics. All three papers addressed or used Bayesian approaches, but the question here, it was partly addressed in the papers, is there anything special on this type of data, and what, and in which cases to use Bayesian approaches, and in which cases resort to frequentist or combinations of them. The usage of concentration, likelihood in your cases, the likelihood functions, it is partly related naturally in a Bayesian context and similar intractable likelihood, so different types of data need different estimation approaches. Could it lead to intractable likelihoods, and could approaches that we know also be used in this case? Second paper by Bergson and Hoff, so indirect information that you mentioned, it reminded me there is a discussion, the awards given recently on 1 week back in Bochum at the World Congress of Probability and Statistics to Filippo Ascolani. So you borrow information, and there is a literature in a Bayesian, empirical Bayesian framework. Perhaps a possibility is to use their work on full-range borrowing of information in a non-parametric Bayesian context. It is a work mainly related also to work at Bocconi University by Igor Prünster and Antonio Lioi. Geographical adjacency structure, that is also in your paper, leads naturally to different aspects, both of spatiotemporal, that were already mentioned, and also, again, more probabilistic. You could model adjacency in kind of random, probabilistic, random matrix or similar context. Could this provide also, again in the line of what I started, further perspectives? Conformal prediction, as you mentioned. So the question is, are there any specialties, any possible even singularities in constructing confidence or credible intervals on sets, and what kind of p-values, e-values that are related to conformal prediction to possibly use in future here? I briefly mentioned there is a typo in your paper at figure 2 that you can read here. It's surely Klopper-Pearson instead of the name mentioned. So the third paper by Jonathan and Thomas. So applications to start with, while I know that Jonathan and both work in mathematical statistics and so on. So, but citizen science data have many applications. A lot of the papers that we hear today are from bird species, from ecology, but there are other applications that also I know of. Could any sector, any scientific field, I come also from economics, there is medicine and healthcare, with, I think, features such data. COVID-19 featured citizen science data, and others, I just imagined law, robotics, which are widely further, but could such type of data be found in any fields and where, which is important for the applications of those methods? The paper of Jonathan and Thomas used Gaussian latent random fields, which are, of course, again, a concept, I will say, on the bound of probability and some mathematical statistical approaches. So which kind of stochastic processes, random elements, and also elements from extreme value theory, which is also on the bound of the two, to possibly use here, and how to study asymptotical properties which are necessary? Are there any specialties to study approaches here in an asymptotic manner? What kind of methods to use? I think none of the papers I have to mention had really go into deepness. Maybe I missed something into this. Again, computational efficiency, Monte Carlo, Markov chain Monte Carlo was mentioned, Langevin adjusted Langevin algorithm. So how to approach computational efficiency here, and how to naturally use this to address the biases. And even further, when you model species behavior, you can use microsimulation, you can use agent simulation to model biological features, but how to combine this with biases in the citizens' data, what kind of approaches could be used here? So to shortly conclude, but this has been mentioned, many of the points and a lot in previous talks, the important things are probably correcting for biases in citizen science data as probably one of the key, or even the key point, exploiting novelties of such type of data and all of its properties in statistical and probability context, computational complexity, how to address these large amounts of data that are now being present, the discussion between frequent distant Bayesian, even distributional aspects. Some paper featured the relationship naturally to non-parametrics, applications, and even further, this was probably one of the intents also of this meeting, how to, in the future, extend the scope and frequency of methodological literature in the future, because one of the key problems when the people, practitioners, I will say, use citizens' data is that the publications do not accept it, because usually the results are considered as biased or unreliable. The editors or reviewers do not know how to handle such publications. So how to extend it and to provide it. I hope I provided at least a few points to be responded in discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andre. So now the floor is open. Thank you for those who stayed for the final part of the meeting. We'd love to hear from you if you're working in citizen science data, or you have any questions or comments on any of the three papers. Please do raise your hand or come up. It can be a short comment or anything to that effect. Yeah, maybe, is that microphone going to work? Yeah, this one here.
So is it short comments from here and discussion from up there? Thanks for all the papers. My comment and question to the authors, really comes out of the proposal for the vote of thanks, which I think expanded on the issues about the sampling problems and the data structure, which I appreciate the speakers didn't have a lot of time to go into. But whilst I think the papers have worked hard to try and address those problems, the other aspect that I'm not sure is addressed is data quality. And in terms of outliers, if you've got a big sample size, then outliers tend not to be too much of a problem. But if we're trying to estimate things like time of first arrival of a new species or return of a species, then I think outliers become a particularly big problem. And one might suggest that if you see a species return particularly early this year, rather unusually early, that's perhaps more likely to be a data error than a true early arrival of a species. And I worry about big data sets. And one of the things big data sets can do is estimate bias really well. I would like to hear a little bit more from the authors about issues of data quality and indeed how much perhaps it matters or maybe it doesn't matter. So that would be my comment. Thanks very much to all the papers and the authors.
Thank you, Simon. Any more comments or questions? Yes, at the back. If we could ask you to come up to, I think the microphone on the other side work too. Yeah, that's your nearest microphone there. Thank you. And actually, it'd be nice if you could give your name and affiliation as well, please.
I'm Gesine Reinhardt from University of Oxford. My question actually relates to data quality, but in a slightly different way. When you've got contaminated data, so when you've got citizen science data where some citizens are just doing it for fun and putting in complete nonsense, you might have data contamination, and some methods are more robust to that than other methods. Would be interesting to look into that further, perhaps.
Thank you so much. Yes, one more here.
Thank you for the great talks, guys, and the very, very interesting papers. I don't know anything in specific about species distributions, but a lot of what you were talking about reminded me that, so I'm from Iceland, my name is Brynjólfur, I was working a lot during the COVID epidemic on modeling, and the way data was gathered there reminds me a lot about citizen data collecting. You know, you have some official statistics, and then you have biases because some people come and get tested. And it reminded me a lot of work done at the Imperial College by Seth Flaxman, Samir Bhatt and others who developed hierarchical Bayesian models where they were modeling the data gathering process and also the infectious diseases. So just about, yeah, if you have had, looked anything into that and see any of your work in that also.
Could we just catch your name and affiliation as well, please? Thanks.
My name is Brynjólfur.
Thank you.
You can call me Binni, B-I-N-N-I, yes.
Cool. All right. Final call for any questions. So after this meeting, there's still an opportunity to contribute to the discussion in writing. Please do encourage particularly those who couldn't make it today but would be very interested in this topic to do so. There's still a few more weeks after this meeting. You can find out on the discussion meetings RSS website how to do that, but encourage your colleagues. Anyone can submit a discussion, so I think it's really great if we also encourage early career colleagues, because it's sort of like a mini publication in some sense, because you can promote some of your own ideas, research ideas, and attach them to this body of work. So please do encourage all your colleagues to submit in writing to the discussion, so we have a nice record of this meeting. But it looks like we're done with questions for today. So, Andy, I think I'll pass back to you to close.
Okay, great, thank you. So we now give an opportunity to the authors of the papers to respond to any of the formal feedback, but also any of the questions that came up. So if I go in order, and there's no requirement to do this, so it's only if you want to. So Eleni and Alex, would you like to come up, either of you, to respond to anything? And you get some, let me see, I've got this written down, so I think you get 5 minutes. Yeah,
Yeah, I don't know if we'll need the whole 5 minutes.
it's okay.
So first, huge thanks. This is an amazing opportunity. What I meant to say when we started was that Emily, who's the first author, is not here because she just had twin girls about 2 weeks ago. And so we are representing Emily here, but she's a butterfly expert of the group, and a data expert in general. So I've made some notes here and taken some photographs of the slides, Ben. Sorry. So I think the spatial, I think they mentioned that the distributions are spatial phenomena, as you've put it. So I think that's crucial, and as you say, we discussed this in the paper, and it kind of links in with the later comment about intractable likelihoods potentially. So it all goes hand in hand. So yes, you definitely need to have spatial effects, structured or unstructured or in some way. And then in the last slide that Alex put up, maybe some of you noticed we had this mixture model which had sort of 2 modes in the south and a single mode in the north, and because phenology changes so much for that particular species. So obviously we need to account for spatial effects and at the same time balance this out with having a model that we can tackle, right? Where we can do some theory to solve with respect to the parameters, you know, for example, the abundances. But it's definitely an important future direction. And the same applies to Gesine. Gesine, by the way, it's nice to see you. I left Oxford about 10 years ago. I haven't seen you since. Thank you for the comment. And it links back, I think, also with Gesine's comment about the essentially quality of the data, and that there's some work that looks at giving weights to observers. So we use a so-called list length. So we compare your list compared to others around who submitted lists nearby and at the same amount of time, and that gives you sort of weight as an observer. Are you generally good at finding stuff or not? And of course that doesn't correct for the fact that you could just be submitting stuff that are not there, which is quite difficult. Although apps are getting smarter and smarter, as already been mentioned with eBird, it does some internal checks, and I think that links again with mention of outliers, especially when you're interested in phenomena such as time to first arrival, though it's not what our paper was about, but it's something that we've spent a lot of time modeling phenology, so it's clearly something that we're interested in. So I think some sort of weighting of records and records is probably what is needed going forward, again in a model that balances complexity with our ability to fit it. And the last thing I wanted to say, and then maybe Alex can take over from that point, we actually had this chat earlier today with Alex, you know, classical Bayesian, and in our paper we considered both, and I think, you know, they have their advantages and disadvantages. When it comes to a Bayesian framework, we find that it's easier when you have a complex data generating process. It's much easier to introduce lots of latent variables and the job's done, and then you pay a little bit of a price computationally. But maybe, yeah, variational inference can take us a little bit further. And then going back to Kerry's comments about bringing stuff together, then you have different data generating processes, different types of records, and even more data and more biases. So I think eventually I can imagine and hope that we can put in all of the data together in a super big model that accounts for all sorts of biases and dependencies spatially and temporally and so on. And I hope that the work we're doing sort of sets the foundation for this kind of super model. I don't know if you want to add anything. Thank you so much for your comments.
Use your notes, that's quite
useful.
By the way, I completely agree with whoever raised the point that in terms of like biases, we're really just scratching the surfaces in terms of all the biases that you need to address when you deal with citizen science data, like data quality has been mentioned. Obviously, we just consider false negative in occupancy data, but with citizen science, it would make sense to start considering false positive as well, because people might just make mistake when they input the data. In terms of, some people have raised the issue like, can you use machine learning, for example, with some of the methods? So actually, it didn't say because of time, but with variational inference, it does actually rely on machine learning, because when you have to compute these gradients, most of the method now, they use automatic differentiation, which actually is one of the cornerstones of machine learning. So you could actually just use neural network inside a model and use machine learning method to propagate these gradients and to perform inference. So there is a borrowing of technique from the machine learning literature in terms of, yeah, obviously in terms of, there's a question about the concentrated likelihood. Obviously, if the likelihood is intractable, then yes, it is an issue. So you need to be able to find the concentrated likelihood for each specific model. When you have a new model, obviously you need to find a new likelihood one. And yeah, I think I'm probably going to address the rest of the question you're writing in my probably a bad idea.
I'm happy to receive those comments and give us some ideas for the future. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. So we then move on to Betsy. Do you want to respond? Yeah.
Yeah, so I'll just respond briefly. Thank you to all the discussants for the comments. I'll respond more thoroughly in writing. But I did want to comment that I think a lot of the comments centered around the fact that we considered, especially my work, I considered well-behaved. I liked that citizen science data. And I do think that there's room, for extensions and considerations of the more complicated dependencies, particularly across the spatial domain, that could be incorporated in future work for me.
Okay, finally, back to Jonathan and Thomas. Would you like to respond?
Dear all, thank you very much to all the discussants for the highly valuable contributions. So they are all very welcomed and much appreciated. We're already looking forward to addressing them in full in the written discussion. So we will here simply attempt to briefly summarize some of the key points raised by the 6 discussants and also provide some first elements of response. The proposer of the vote of thanks, Ben Swallow, has emphasized the attractive properties of many citizen science data, large volume, low cost of acquisition, and often very good spatial temporal sampling coverage. At the same time, it is paramount to explicitly consider the complex sampling process and the variety of biases that may arise, and this even more in cases where statistical predictions are used in official contexts. More methodological developments of formal validation tools for latent variable models are needed. He has further raised the question of how to best approach the combination of citizen science with more structured data, and how much added value such data fusion models could actually provide in concrete applications. Moreover, he asked how multivariate extremes approaches could provide additional modeling value in the context of our application on first arrival dates. So regarding his last point concerning the multivariate extremes approach, we agree that one could seek to jointly model multiple species at a given location, but it could also concern modeling multiple locations, and in other words, modeling the spatial dependence, where models from the flourishing field of spatial extreme value theory could play an interesting role.
Yeah, the seconder of the vote of thanks, Kerry Mangerson, insisted on the need for rigorous statistical learning and decision-making environments when using citizen science data, and also mentioned that computational approaches must be efficient to handle these large and complex data sets, all right? And this responsibility is a heavy and difficult one, but it lies on us statisticians because we're the data whisperers, as she puts it very well. She states that the works proposed in the discussed papers treat relatively well-behaved citizen science data, which we agree, and then raise questions on how less structured citizen science data could be exploited efficiently. Moreover, in her opinion, there should not only be efforts invested into data fusion, but more generally on hybridizing state-of-the-art methods from statistics and machine learning. Andre asked many relevant questions. Thank you for your comments, including the following. What other scientific fields could take advantage of citizen science applications? What non-Gaussian probabilistic tools could be proved useful in citizen science modeling, and how to check asymptotic assumptions about extreme events. He further mentioned the use of the Bayesian framework, or the Bayesian approach, which we strongly believe provides a powerful inference framework that allows for including prior information, which is made even more valuable in the citizen science data framework, where data is often distributed very heterogeneously. For instance, here's just a quick example. If some spatial temporal domains are visited at high frequency, the corresponding sampling effort could be regarded as being exhaustive, and the structure of the model could be modified in this Bayesian framework to try to improve the identifiability of various model components. We agree on the broad application of citizen science to other fields. Asymptotics are a great point, but from a pragmatic point of view, it is worth noting that even if the asymptotics are not reached in data, theoretically motivated and flexible parametric models remain flexible models that can well capture relevant aspects related to processes of interest. Simon from the audience raised the question on how and whether bias can be identified and potentially easily identified from large data sets. Another comment from the audience calls for a more profound discussion of the data quality in citizen science and the availability of robust tools to assess it. Benny, I hope I got your name correct, asked if methods such as those proposed here for ecology could be relevant for epidemiology and health. We agree with all the points made by the discussants, and we are excited about the novel ideas they raise for moving forward with citizen science statistics. We look forward to addressing them in detail in our written reply in JRSA. Thank you very much.
So we're coming to the end. So thank you so much for all of you for taking part in this meeting. I know it's late in the day. The RSS has a rich tradition of discussion meetings, and so thank you all for being part of yet another excellent set of talks. But if we give a round of applause really to, a final round of applause really to the speakers, to those that gave the voters thanks, to the discussants, and for Adam and the discussions meeting committee who have organized this event. So thank you all, and have a nice evening.